The morning mist clung to the pastures of Oakwood County as Gareth Shaw made his way to the old red barn behind his farmhouse. But what he discovered inside would shatter everything he thought he knew about helping strangers. Huddled in the corner, between hay bales and farm equipment, was a woman in an elaborate white wedding gown, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her expensive veil torn and tangled. This wasn't just a runaway bride having second thoughts about marriage. This woman was fleeing for her life from a man who had orchestrated the ultimate deception, a wedding that was actually a trap. The groom wasn't her beloved. He was her captor, and the ceremony was designed to give him legal control over her. Life and fortune forever. What started as a simple act of kindness would soon put Gareth and his teenage son in the crosshairs of a dangerous criminal, while revealing that sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the darkest secrets. Hit that like button if you've ever discovered that helping someone meant risking everything you hold dear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow echoed across the rolling hills of Oakwood County as Gareth Shaw pulled on his worn work boots and stepped onto the front porch of his two-story farmhouse. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to handle whatever life threw at him, though the lines around his eyes spoke of challenges that had aged him beyond his years. The September morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and the promise of autumn. Gareth had inherited this 200-acre farm from his grandfather, and despite the financial struggles that came with maintaining such a large property as a single father, he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The land was in his blood, just as it had been in his family for 3 generations. He made his way across the yard, past the vegetable garden where tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and the chicken coop, where his small flock was already pecking at their morning feed. His destination was the old red barn that stood about 50 yards behind the house, its weathered wood and tin roof a testament to decades of Wisconsin winters and summers. Gareth had been putting off this morning's task for weeks, reorganizing the hay storage and checking on the equipment before the harvest season began in earnest. As a single father raising 17-year-old Dylan, every spare moment was precious, and farm maintenance often took a backseat to homework help and ensuring his son stayed on track for his senior year. The barn's heavy wooden doors creaked as he pulled them open, flooding the interior with golden morning light. The familiar smell of hay and old wood greeted him, along with something else, something that made him pause. There was a different quality to the air, a sense that something was out of place in his well-ordered world. That's when he saw her, huddled between 2 massive hay bales in the far corner of the barn, was a figure in white. At first glance, Gareth thought perhaps Dylan had left some old sheets or tarps in the corner, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the barn's high windows, the truth became unmistakably clear. It was a woman, and she was wearing a wedding dress, not just any wedding dress, but an elaborate gown that probably cost more than Gareth's monthly farm income. The silk fabric was stained with dirt and what looked like grass stains, the intricate beadwork catching the morning light like scattered diamonds. A long veil, torn in several places, was wrapped around her shoulders like a makeshift shawl. Woman was awake, her dark eyes wide with fear as she pressed herself further into the corner. She couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features that spoke of careful breeding and a privileged upbringing. But there was nothing privileged about her current state. She looked terrified, exhausted, and desperate. "Ma'am," Gareth called softly, not wanting to startle her further. "Are you hurt?" The woman's head snapped up, and he could see tears tracks streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. She studied his face with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily, taking in his work clothes, his calloused hands, and the genuine concern in his expression. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying for hours. "Please don't call anyone. I can't." I can't go back." Gareth remained where he was, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. In his years of farming, dealing with injured animals, he'd learned that approaching slowly and speaking calmly was often the difference between helping and causing more harm. "I'm Gareth Shaw," he said gently. "This is my barn, my farm. What's your name?" The woman hesitated, as if even sharing her identity might somehow betray her location. "Jade," she finally whispered. "Jade Fern." "Jade, how long have you been out?" "Here. I don't know, since last night, maybe." "It was dark when She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of her world together. Gareth noticed several things at once that set off alarm bells in his mind. First, despite the expensive dress, Jade wasn't wearing shoes. Her feet were bare and dirty, with what looked like cuts from running through rough terrain. Second, there was a bruise on her left wrist that looked suspiciously like finger marks. Third, and most concerning, was the way she kept glancing toward the barn doors, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Are you running from someone?" he asked quietly. Jade's composure cracked, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't understand," she said. If he finds me, I'll never get away again." The wedding was supposed to be yesterday, but it wasn't. It wasn't what everyone thought it was. "What do you mean?" "He's not my fiancé," Jade said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my captor. And yesterday was supposed to be the day. He made it all legal." The words hung in the air between them, and Gareth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September morning. This wasn't just a case of wedding day nerves or a bride having second thoughts. This was something far more sinister, and he was now standing in the middle of it. "Jade," he said carefully, "I think you need to tell me everything." As Jade's words echoed in the barn, "He's my captor," Gareth felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. It was the same feeling he'd carried for the past 4 years, ever since the day he'd become Dylan's sole guardian and the keeper of 3 generations of Shaw family legacy. Gareth Shaw hadn't planned on being a single father at 31. He'd been working as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company in Madison, living in a comfortable suburban home with his wife Rebecca and their 13-year-old son. Life had been predictable, secure, and exactly what he'd thought he wanted. Then Rebecca's car accident on an icy February morning changed everything in an instant. The grief had been overwhelming, but what came after was almost worse. The slow realization that Rebecca had been the glue holding their family together. She'd managed Dylan's school schedule, his friend relationships, his emotional needs. She'd been the one who remembered parent-teacher conferences, doctor's appointments, and which foods Dylan would actually eat. Gareth had been a good father, but Rebecca had been the primary parent, and suddenly he was flying blind. The suburban house felt like a mausoleum filled with memories he couldn't bear to face every day. Dylan, struggling with his own grief, had become withdrawn and angry, his grades plummeting as he pushed away anyone who tried to help. That's when Gareth's grandfather, Henry Shaw, had made an offer that seemed like both a lifeline and a burden. "The farm's too much for these old bones," Henry had said during one of their weekly visits. "But I can't bear to sell it to strangers. It's been in our family since 1952. Maybe you and Dylan need a fresh start, and maybe this old place needs some young blood again." The decision to leave his engineering career and move to the farm had been one of the hardest Gareth had ever made. He'd grown up visiting the farm during summers, learning to drive a tractor before he could legally drive a car, helping with harvests and livestock. But knowing how to do something as a teenager and actually making a living at it as an adult were entirely different challenges. The first year had been brutal. Learning to manage 200 acres of corn and soybeans while simultaneously trying to connect with a grieving teenager had pushed Gareth to his breaking point more than once. The farm's finances were precarious, Henry had been too proud to admit how much he'd been struggling in his final years, and the equipment was older than Delane. Some nights, Gareth would sit at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake that would cost them everything. But slowly, something had begun to shift. Dylan, initially resistant to the move, had found solace in the wide open spaces and the physical demands of farm work. Working side by side in the fields, they'd begun to talk again, really talk, for the first time since Rebecca's death. The boy who'd been angry and lost in suburbia had rediscovered his curiosity and purpose in the rhythm of rural life. Now, 4 years later, Gareth had found his footing as both a farmer and a single father. The farm wasn't making them rich, but it was sustainable, and more importantly, it felt like home. Dylan was thriving as a senior at Millbrook County High School, where he played on the baseball team and had been accepted to the University of Wisconsin's agricultural program for the following fall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Gareth would wake at 5:30, check on the livestock, and start the coffee before Dylan emerged from his room at 6:15, perpetually running late for the 7 a.m. school bus. They'd grab breakfast together, usually toast and whatever fruit was in season from their small orchard, while Dylan complained about whatever assignment he'd procrastinated on, and Gareth reviewed the day's farm tasks. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. Gareth had learned to find satisfaction in the tangible results of physical work, the way a well-maintained field of corn could stretch toward the horizon like a green ocean. He'd discovered that he was good at problem-solving with his hands, whether it was fixing a broken irrigation system or helping Dylan work through a difficult math concept at the kitchen table. The community had embraced them too, in the way that small agricultural towns embraced people who were willing to work hard and contribute. Gareth served on the volunteer fire department, helped organize the annual county fair, and had become someone his neighbors could count on when their own equipment broke down or they needed an extra hand during harvest season. But there were lonely nights when Dylan was at a friend's house or a school event, when the silence of the farmhouse felt too heavy. Gareth would find himself standing on the front porch, looking out at the fields bathed in moonlight, wondering if this was the life Rebecca would have wanted for them. He'd dated a few times over the years, a teacher from Dylan's school, a nurse from the medical clinic in town, but nothing had developed into anything serious. Part of him worried that he was too settled in his bachelor routine, too comfortable with the simple rhythm of work and family responsibility. That routine had been shattered the moment he'd opened the barn doors and found Jade Fern huddled in the corner, terror in her eyes and desperation in her voice. As she spoke about captors and false weddings, Gareth felt the same protective instinct that had driven him to uproot his entire life, to give Dylan a better chance at healing. Someone needed help, and despite the potential complications, walking away wasn't an option. Standing in his barn, looking at a woman whose expensive wedding dress told a story of wealth and privilege, but whose bruised wrists spoke of something far darker, Gareth Shaw made the same choice he'd been making for 4 years. When life presented him with a challenge, he would face it head-on, one problem at a time. Gareth settled onto a hay bale across from Jade, maintaining enough distance to keep her comfortable while close enough to hear her whispered words. The morning sun was climbing higher, sending shafts of golden light through the barn's weathered windows, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled over both of them. "Take your time," Gareth said gently. "But if someone's looking for you, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Jade pulled the torn veil tighter around her shoulders, her fingers trembling as she began to speak. "My name is Jade Fern, and until 6 months ago, I was living what everyone thought was a fairy tale life. I was the sole heir to Fern Industries. My parents built it from nothing into a multi-million-dollar agricultural equipment company. Gareth recognized the name immediately. Fern Industries was based out of Milwaukee and had contracts with farms across the Midwest. Their tractors and harvesting equipment were some of the most reliable in the business, though far beyond the budget of a small operation like his. My parents died in a plane crash last winter, Jade continued, her voice barely audible. It was sudden, unexpected. They were flying to a business meeting in Chicago when the weather turned bad. I went from being someone's daughter to being worth $47 million overnight. She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Everyone kept telling me how sorry they were, how they were there to help me through this difficult time. The lawyers, the board members, the family friends who'd known me since I was little. But suddenly, all these people who'd never paid much attention to me before were very interested in my well-being. Gareth was beginning to see where this was heading, and he felt his stomach tighten with dread. One of those people was Alden Sterling, Jade said, and the way she spoke his name was like pronouncing a curse. He was my father's business partner, someone who'd been around since I was in high school. 20 years older than me, divorced, charming in that way that successful men can be. He started calling it, looking out for me and helping me navigate this difficult transition. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He'd take me to dinner to discuss business decisions, help me understand the legal paperwork, introduce me to people he said I needed to know. I was grieving and overwhelmed, and having someone who'd known my parents guide me felt like a lifeline. Jade's hands were shaking now, and Gareth could see the effort it was taking for her to continue. But then the guidance became control. He convinced me to move out of my apartment and into his estate in Brookfield, saying it would be safer and that I needed someone looking after me. He had me sign papers that I didn't fully understand, giving him power of attorney temporarily, while I was dealing with my grief. That's when everything changed. Suddenly, I couldn't access my own bank accounts without his approval. I couldn't make business decisions without his input. When I tried to object or ask questions, he'd remind me how unstable I'd been since my parents' death, how I wasn't thinking clearly, how much I needed his guidance. Gareth felt a cold anger building in his chest. He'd seen this kind of manipulation before, predators who targeted vulnerable people and slowly stripped away their autonomy until they felt completely helpless. The wedding was his final move, Jade said, her voice growing stronger with anger. 6 months ago, he started talking about how we'd grown close, how he thought my parents would have approved of us being together. I kept saying no, but he'd twist everything around, make it seem like I was being irrational or ungrateful. When I finally tried to leave, I discovered that he'd frozen all my accounts, claimed I was mentally unstable and a danger to myself. He had doctors who backed up his claims, lawyers who said the paperwork was ironclad. I was trapped in his house with staff who reported everything I did back to him. The wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a legal ceremony designed to give him permanent control over my inheritance. Once we were married, everything would belong to him, and I'd have no legal recourse. The pieces were falling into place, and Gareth understood why Jade looked so terrified. "How did you get away?" "Yesterday morning, while he was meeting with the wedding planner, I overheard him on the phone with someone. He was laughing, talking about how the grieving little bird would finally stop causing problems after today. He said once the ceremony was over, he'd have her committed to a private facility where she'd never bother anyone again." Jade's composure finally cracked completely, and she buried her face in her hands. "He wasn't just stealing my money, Gareth. He was planning to lock me away forever. I realized that if I didn't run right then, I'd never get another chance. So you ran from your own wedding?" "During the ceremony," Jade said, lifting her head to meet his eyes. "I was standing there in that church, surrounded by his friends and business associates, people who thought they were witnessing a beautiful love story, and I realized that this was my last moment of freedom. So when the minister asked if I took Alden to be my husband, I said no. I said it loud enough for everyone to hear, and then I ran. I ran out of the church, through the parking lot, into the woods behind the venue. I had no plan, no destination. I just knew I had to get as far away as possible before he could stop me. I walked all night, trying to stay off the roads, and when I saw your barn this morning, I thought maybe I could rest for a few hours before figuring out what to do next. Gareth was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. This wasn't just a domestic dispute or a case of an overbearing fiancé. This was calculated, systematic abuse designed to steal a woman's entire life. "Jade," he said finally, "we need to call the police." "No." The word came out as a strangled cry. "You don't understand. Alden has connections everywhere. Police officers, judges, politicians, they all owe him favors or do business with him. Who do you think they'll believe? The respected businessman or the mentally unstable heiress who ran away from her own wedding?" Gareth felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about offering temporary shelter to someone in need. This was about standing up to a powerful man who had the resources and connections to destroy anyone who got in his way. But as he looked at Jade, bruised, terrified, and utterly alone, Gareth Shaw made the same choice he'd made 4 years ago when he decided to uproot his life for Dylan's sake. Some things were more important than safety. "Then we'll figure out another way," he said quietly. "But you're not facing this alone anymore." The first priority was getting Jade out of the wedding dress. Not only was it conspicuous, but Gareth could see how the elaborate gown was weighing her down both physically and emotionally, a constant reminder of the trap she'd barely escaped. "We need to get you some practical clothes and food," Gareth said, standing and brushing hay dust from his jeans. "But first, I want you to know that no one's going to find you here without going through me first." Jade looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Alden has private investigators, security people. He won't just let me disappear. Then we'll deal with that when the time comes." Gareth replied firmly, "Right now you need basic necessities. Can you walk okay? Your feet look pretty torn up." Looking down at her bare, dirt-stained feet, Jade nodded slowly. "They're sore, but I can manage." "Good. The house is just across the yard, but I want to take a look around first. Make sure no one's been by." Gareth moved to the barn's main doors and carefully scanned the property. The dirt road leading to his farm stretched empty in both directions, and the neighboring properties were far enough away that casual visitors would be noticed long before they reached the house. "All clear," he said, returning to Jade's side. "But we're going to take the back way, just in case." They exited through a smaller side door that opened toward the rear of the farmhouse. Gareth led Jade along a path that wound through his vegetable garden and past the chicken coop, keeping them hidden from the main road. As they walked, he found himself glancing frequently at his unexpected guest, still struggling to reconcile the terrified woman beside him with the story she'd told about multi-million-dollar inheritances and criminal conspiracies. The back door of the farmhouse opened into a mudroom connected to the kitchen. Gareth was grateful for the familiar surroundings, the worn wooden floors, the coffee pot still warm from his morning routine, the refrigerator covered with Dylan's baseball schedule and farm supply catalogs. Normal life, which suddenly felt very precious. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "I'll find you something to wear and get those cuts cleaned up." Jade settled carefully into one of the wooden chairs, the wedding dress's voluminous skirt pooling around her. "I feel ridiculous," she said quietly. "Like I'm wearing a costume for a play I never auditioned for." "We'll fix that," Gareth assured her, already heading toward the stairs. "I think I have some of Rebecca's old clothes stored upstairs. She was about your size." He found what he was looking for in a cedar chest in the guest bedroom: jeans, a soft cotton sweater, and undergarments that Rebecca had rarely worn. It had been 2 years since he'd opened this chest, and for a moment, the familiar scent of his late wife's perfume made him pause. But Rebecca would have approved of what he was doing. She'd always been the first to help neighbors in crisis, often bringing casseroles to families dealing with illness or job loss. Returning to the kitchen, with the clothes and a first aid kit, Gareth found Jade staring out the window toward the road, her body tense with anxiety. "Every car that goes by," she said without turning around. "I think it might be him." "Highway's a quarter-mile away," Gareth said, setting the clothes on the counter. "Anyone coming up our road will see them long before they reach the house. And right now, you look like exactly what you are, someone who spent the night outdoors." "He's probably searching hotels and airports, not rural barns." Jade managed a small smile at that. "You're right. I've been looking over my shoulder for months. It's hard to turn that off." Gareth handed her the clothes and pointed toward a small bathroom off the kitchen. "Get changed, and I'll make us some breakfast. When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning, I think. I was too nervous to eat much before the—" She gestured at the wedding dress. "Understandable. There's soap and towels in there, and take your time. I'll be right here." While Jade cleaned up and changed clothes, Gareth busied himself preparing breakfast and trying to think through their options. His engineering background had taught him to approach problems systematically, but this situation had variables he'd never encountered before. How do you protect someone from a predator with money, connections, and apparently no moral boundaries? 20 minutes later, Jade emerged from the bathroom transformed. Rebecca's clothes fit her well, and with her face clean and her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she looked younger and less fragile, but the fear in her eyes remained. "Better?" Gareth asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. "Much, thank you." Jade ate with the careful precision of someone who'd been taught proper table manners, but also with the genuine hunger of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for too long. "We need to talk about what happens next," Gareth said, pouring coffee for both of them. "My son Dylan will be home from school around 3:30. He's 17, mature for his age, but this is going to be a lot to process." Jade set down her fork, concern creasing her features. "I don't want to put him in danger. If Alden finds me here, Dylan can handle himself," Gareth interrupted. "But more importantly, he deserves to know what's going on. I don't keep secrets from him about things that affect our safety." "What will you tell him? The truth. That someone needed help, and we're providing it. That there might be some risk involved, but that we're being careful." Gareth met her eyes across the table. "He'll understand. We've been through difficult times before." They spent the rest of the morning establishing ground rules. Jade would stay in the guest bedroom upstairs, away from windows facing the road. If any unexpected visitors arrived, she'd retreat to the basement, which had a hidden storage room behind the furnace that Henry Shaw had built during the Cold War. Gareth would handle all communication with the outside world, and they'd avoid using phones or internet connections that could potentially be traced. "This feels surreal," Jade said as Gareth showed her the basement hiding spot. 3 days ago, I was planning a wedding I didn't want. Now I'm learning about secret rooms and escape routes." "I know it's a lot," Gareth said. "But you made the hardest choice already. You chose freedom over security. Everything else is just logistics." As they climbed back upstairs, Jade caught his arm. "Gareth, why are you doing this? You don't know me, and you're risking everything, your farm, your son's safety, your own life, to help a stranger." Gareth considered the question, thinking about Dylan's transformation after Rebecca's death, about the way rural communities looked after their own, about the engineering principle that the strongest structures were built on solid foundations, because Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the safe thing to do, he said simply. And because everyone deserves the chance to choose their own life. The sound of the school bus rumbling down the road interrupted their conversation. Dylan would be home in 10 minutes, and their small circle of knowledge was about to expand. Gareth just hoped his son was ready for the conversation they were about to have. The rumble of the school bus faded into the distance as Dylan Shaw jogged up the gravel driveway, his baseball gear slung over one shoulder and his backpack threatening to spill textbooks onto the ground. At 17, he'd inherited his father's lean build and steady gaze. But where Gareth moved with deliberate precision, Dylan carried the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Dad," he called out as he kicked off his cleats on the front porch. "Why's there a car parked weird behind the—" He stopped mid-sentence as he entered the kitchen and saw Jade sitting at the table, a coffee mug cradled in her hands. Gareth had been dreading this moment, but he'd learned that with Dylan, direct honesty worked better than gentle deflection. "Dylan, this is Jade. She needed help, and she's going to be staying with us for a while." Dylan's eyes moved between his father and their unexpected guest, taking in Jade's borrowed clothes, her still bruised wrists, and the tension that seemed to radiate from both adults. "What kind of help?" he asked quietly. "The kind that might be dangerous," Gareth replied. "Sit down. I'll explain everything." For the next 20 minutes, Gareth laid out Jade's situation in careful detail. He watched his son's expression shift. From confusion to anger to protective determination, the same progression of emotions Gareth himself had experienced that morning. When he finished, Dylan was quiet for a long moment. "So this Sterling guy is basically a criminal with money," Dylan said finally. "And now he's looking for Jade." "That's about the size of it," Gareth confirmed. Dylan turned to Jade, studying her with the directness that teenagers could manage without seeming rude. "Are you okay? I mean, physically? Dad, did you check if she needs a doctor?" "I'm fine," Jade said softly, clearly moved by the teenager's immediate concern. "Your father has been incredibly kind." "Good," Dylan said matter-of-factly. "So what's the plan? I assume we're not just going to hand her over to the cops and hope for the best." Gareth felt a surge of pride in his son's maturity. "We're still working on that. For now, we keep her safe and figure out our next move." "Cool. I'll move my Xbox up to the attic so Jade can have the guest room without hearing me playing Battlefield all night." Dylan shouldered his backpack again. "I've got homework, but let me know if you need anything, okay?" After Dylan headed upstairs, Jade stared at Gareth in amazement. He just accepted it. "No questions about why you'd risk everything for a stranger." "Dylan's been through enough loss to understand that life can change in an instant," Gareth said. "He knows that sometimes you have to make hard choices based on what's right, not what's safe." As if summoned by the mention of loss, the conversation naturally turned to deeper waters. Jade set down her coffee mug and really looked at Gareth for the first time, not as her rescuer or protector, but as a person carrying his own burdens. "You mentioned your wife earlier, Rebecca?" she asked gently. Gareth nodded, settling back in his chair. "She died 4 years ago, car accident on an icy road. Dylan was 13, and I was completely unprepared to be a single parent. That must have been terrifying." "It was. Rebecca was the heart of our family. She remembered everything, managed everything, knew how to talk to Dylan about things I couldn't even recognize he was struggling with." Gareth stared out the kitchen window toward the fields. "For the first year, I felt like I was failing at everything that mattered." Jade understood that feeling intimately. "When my parents died, everyone kept telling me how strong I was, how well I was handling everything. But inside, I felt like a little girl who'd lost her way in a crowd. Everything that had defined my life, being someone's daughter, having a family, knowing my place in the world, was just gone." "Is that how "Sterling got his hooks in you?" Gareth asked. "Offering to be what your parents had been." "Exactly." He presented himself as this wise, protective figure who would guide me through the complexities of business and money management. He made me feel like without him, I'd make terrible mistakes and lose everything my parents had built. Jade's voice grew bitter. It never occurred to me that he was the terrible mistake. Gareth reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "You figured it out, though. That takes incredible strength." "Not strength, desperation." Jade turned her hand palm up, briefly clasping Gareth's fingers before pulling away. "I was so focused on not disappointing my parents' memory that I nearly let someone steal my entire future." "What were they like?" "Your parents?" For the first time since Gareth had found her in the barn, Jade's smile was genuine. "They were wonderful workaholics who built fern industries from nothing, but never forgot where they came from. My dad could design agricultural equipment that would revolutionize farming, then spent his weekend teaching me how to change the oil in my car. My mom ran the business side with an iron fist but cried during every Disney movie. They sound like good people. They were. They would have hated Alden Sterling on sight. My dad always said that anyone who tried to make you smaller wasn't worth your time." Jade's expression darkened. "I should have listened to that advice." "You were grieving," Gareth said. "People in grief are vulnerable, and predators know that. Sterling counted on you being too emotionally overwhelmed to see what he was doing. Just like you were overwhelmed after Rebecca died." Gareth nodded. "The difference is, I had Dylan to focus on. Even when I felt like I was drowning, I knew he needed me to figure it out. Having someone to protect gave me purpose." "And now you're protecting me," Jade observed. "Is that what this is about? You're used to being the person people depend on?" The question caught Gareth off guard. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of helping Jade that he hadn't examined his own motivations too closely. "Maybe partly," he admitted, "but it's more than that. When I saw you in that barn, terrified and alone, it reminded me of how Dylan looked after Rebecca died. Like the world had become a dangerous place where nothing made sense anymore. And you couldn't walk away from that, could you? If you found someone who needed help, could you just drive past?" Jade considered this. "Before all this happened, I probably would have. I was raised to let other people handle problems, staff, lawyers, security. I never learned how to be the person who stepped up when someone needed help." "You're learning now," Gareth said. "You stood up to Sterling when it mattered most. You chose your freedom over his promises of security, with nowhere to go and no plan beyond running. Sometimes that's the bravest choice of all, choosing the unknown over the unacceptable." As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, Gareth realized something had shifted between them. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim, but two people who'd survived devastating losses and found their way to a kind of understanding. They'd both learned that life could change in an instant, that the people you thought you could count on might disappear, and that sometimes strength came from accepting help rather than trying to handle everything alone. "Thank you," Jade said, quietly, "not just for the clothes and food and safety, for seeing me as a person instead of just a problem to be solved." "Thank you for trusting me with your story," Gareth replied, "for letting us help." Outside, they could hear Dylan shooting. Baskets at the hoop mounted on the barn, the rhythmic bounce of the ball a comforting sound of normalcy. For the first time since discovering Jade that morning, Gareth allowed himself to hope that maybe, somehow, they'd find a way through this that didn't end in disaster. The next 3 days passed in a carefully orchestrated routine that began to feel surprisingly natural. Jade had insisted on contributing rather than simply hiding, and it quickly became apparent that her privileged upbringing had included a surprisingly practical education. While she'd never worked a traditional job, growing up as the heir to an agricultural equipment company had given her knowledge that proved Invaluable on a working farm. It started on the second morning when Gareth was struggling with a mechanical issue on his aging combine harvester. The machine had been making concerning noises for weeks, but with harvest season approaching, he couldn't afford the downtime or expense of taking it to a professional repair shop. He was lying on his back beneath the massive machine, flashlight in one hand and wrench in the other, when Jade appeared beside him. "That sounds like a bearing issue in the secondary drive shaft," she said, crouching down to peer at the machinery. "The pitch is too high for a belt problem, and it's too consistent for loose bolts." Gareth slid out from under the combine, grease smeared across his cheek, and stared at her in amazement. "How do you know that?" Jade smiled sheepishly. "My father insisted I understand every piece of equipment we manufactured. I spent summers working in the Fern Industries testing facility, learning how to diagnose problems by sound, feel, and visual inspection. He said you couldn't sell something you didn't understand completely." What followed was an hour of Jade guiding Gareth through a systematic diagnostic process that would have taken him days to figure out on his own. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical. She knew exactly which panels to remove, which components to check first, and how to identify worn parts by their appearance and feel. When they finally located the failing bearing, she was able to provide the exact part number and specifications needed for replacement. "This is going to save me at least $1,000 in repair costs," Gareth said as they walked back to the house, both covered in grease, but wearing satisfied expressions. "Maybe more." "It feels good to be useful," Jade replied, and Gareth could hear genuine contentment in her voice. "I'd forgotten what it was like to solve problems instead of being treated like one." Dylan arrived home from school to find them both cleaned up and working in the kitchen, Jade teaching his father how to prepare what she called proper comfort food, a recipe for beef stew that had been passed down through her family for generations. The teenager lingered in the doorway, watching the easy interaction between the two adults. "She's really good at this stuff, isn't she?" Dylan said to his father when Jade stepped out to gather herbs from the garden. "Better than good," Gareth replied. "She knows more about farm equipment than some people who've been doing this their whole lives. And she's been helping me organize the business records too. Apparently, I've been keeping terrible books." This was true. Jade's business education had revealed itself in other ways throughout the week. She'd taken one look at Gareth's haphazard system of invoices, receipts, and tax documents and immediately set about creating an organized filing system that would actually allow him to track expenses and profits effectively. Her laptop, which she'd managed to grab during her escape from Sterling's house, contained spreadsheet templates and financial tracking software that transformed Gareth's record-keeping from chaotic to professional. "You're probably losing money in tax deductions you don't know you can claim," she'd explained while sorting through receipts. "And this organizational system will make it much easier to track seasonal patterns and plan for equipment maintenance. But it wasn't just practical skills that Jade brought to their household. Her presence seemed to unlock something in Dylan that Gareth hadn't seen since before Rebecca's death. The teenager had always been mature for his age, but living with just his father for 4 years had made him perhaps too serious, too focused on being responsible rather than enjoying his youth. Jade, however, had a playful side that emerged as she grew more comfortable. She challenged Dylan to chess matches that stretched late into the evening, introduced him to card games she'd learned during her privileged youth, and listened with genuine interest to his college plans and career ambitions. More importantly, she asked questions about his life that weren't related to grades or chores: what music he liked, which teachers were his favorites, what he planned to do when he graduated. "She talks to me like I'm interesting," Dylan confided to his father one evening while they were doing dishes. "Not like I'm a problem to be managed or a project to be completed. Just like I'm worth talking to." Gareth understood exactly what his son meant. In the years since Rebecca's death, most of their conversations had been practical: homework, farm work, future plans, daily logistics. Jade's presence had somehow given them permission to talk about other things, to remember that they were a family, not just a functioning unit. The change was perhaps most evident during their evening meals. What had once been quick, utilitarian affairs, often eaten while standing in the kitchen or reviewing the next day's schedule, had transformed into lingering conversations around the dining room table. Jade was a natural storyteller, sharing carefully chosen anecdotes from her travels, her education, and her life before Sterling's control. She asked thoughtful questions about their community, their neighbors, and their history with the farm. "Tell me about your grandfather," she said one evening, gesturing toward an old photograph on the mantelpiece that showed a weather-beaten man standing beside a much younger version of the red barn. Gareth found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years. How Henry Shaw had taught him to read weather patterns by watching the behavior of their livestock. How the old man had insisted that farming was as much about understanding the land as it was about working it. How he'd built the secret room in the basement during the height of Cold War paranoia. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," Jade said. "The kind of person who understood that real wealth comes from building something that lasts. Unlike some people," Dylan added pointedly, and Gareth could hear the protective edge in his son's voice when it came to Jade's situation. It was during one of these conversations that they were interrupted by the rumble of an approaching vehicle. All three of them tensed immediately, the comfortable domesticity evaporating as they remembered the danger that still lurked beyond their property lines. "Expecting anyone?" Jade asked quietly, already starting to rise from her chair. "No," Gareth replied, moving to the window to peer through the curtains. "But it's okay. That's just Frank Morrison from the neighboring farm. He stops by sometimes to borrow tools or check on us." Frank Morrison was a man in his 60s who'd been farming in Oakwood County for most of his adult life. His property bordered theirs to the south, and he'd been one of the first neighbors to welcome Gareth and Dylan when they'd moved to the farm 4 years earlier. He was also, unfortunately, the kind of man who noticed everything and asked direct questions about what he observed. "Evening, Gareth," Frank said as he climbed out of his pickup truck. "Saw lights on in the main house and thought I'd stop by. Haven't seen you around much this week." "Just keeping busy with harvest prep," Gareth replied, stepping onto the front porch but not inviting Frank inside. "What brings you by?" "Well, that's just it," Frank said, removing his worn baseball cap and scratching his head. "Been some unusual activity in the area this week. Couple of fancy cars driving around, stopping at properties and asking questions about whether folks have seen anything unusual. City types wearing expensive suits and driving vehicles that cost more than my annual income." Gareth felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman," they said. "Young, dark hair, might be confused or disoriented." They had a picture, but I didn't get a good look at it. Frank's sharp eyes studied Gareth's face. "Said she was mentally unstable. Might be dangerous to herself. Asked if I'd seen any strangers around, any signs of someone camping out or hiding on properties." The two men stood in silence for a moment, and Gareth could almost feel Frank's curiosity like a physical weight. His neighbor wasn't a gossip, but he was observant and protective of his community. If he suspected something was wrong, he wouldn't simply mind his own business. "Frank," Gareth said carefully, "if someone was in trouble, real trouble, not the kind that gets solved by calling the authorities, what would you do?" Frank Morrison had been a farmer long enough to understand that sometimes the official answer wasn't the right answer. He studied Gareth's face for a long moment, then glanced toward the house where warm light spilled from the kitchen windows. "I'd figure that sometimes good people need help from other good people," Frank said slowly. "And I'd mind my own business unless someone asked for my help directly." "I appreciate that," Gareth said. "But I'd also want to make sure that whatever was happening. It wasn't putting my neighbors in danger they weren't prepared for. Frank's tone was serious now. These men asking questions aren't local law enforcement, Gareth. They're private security, and they're well-funded. If you're involved in something over your head, you need to know that. Gareth made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. If I needed advice from someone who's lived in this community longer than I have, someone who understands how things work around here, would you be willing to listen? Frank nodded slowly. Coffee's on in my kitchen if you want to talk. Tonight or whenever you're ready. After Frank left, Gareth returned to the house to find Jade and Dylan waiting anxiously in the kitchen. He knows something's up, Dylan said. Immediately. But he's not going to cause problems, Gareth replied. Frank Morrison is good people. The question is, do we trust him with the truth? Jade was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the neighboring farm where Frank's porch light glowed in the distance. Those men he described, that's Alden's security team. If they're asking questions in the area, it means they've traced me this far. Which means our window for staying hidden is closing, Gareth said grimly. Maybe it's time to stop hiding, Jade said, surprising both of them. Maybe it's time to start fighting back. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of low-hanging clouds that promised rain before evening. Gareth was in the barn checking on the combine repairs when he heard the distant sound of multiple vehicles approaching on the county road. The sound was wrong, too many engines, too expensive, moving too slowly for normal traffic. He stepped outside and felt his blood run cold. 3 black SUVs were turning into his driveway, moving in a coordinated formation that spoke of professional security rather than casual visitors. Through the barn's back door, he could see Jade hanging laundry on the line behind the house, completely exposed and unaware of the approaching danger. Jade, he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with urgent intensity. Inside, now. She looked up, saw his expression, and immediately dropped the laundry basket. Years of living under Sterling's control had taught her to recognize danger even when she couldn't yet see it. She was through the back door and up the stairs to the basement entrance within seconds. Dylan emerged from the chicken coop, took one look at his father's face and the approaching vehicles, and immediately understood the situation. How many? He asked quietly as he jogged over to where Gareth stood. 3 SUVs, probably 2 or 3 men per vehicle. Gareth's mind was racing through options. The basement hiding room would keep Jade safe, but only if these men didn't already know exactly where she was. Stay close to me, but let me do the talking. The lead SUV pulled to a stop directly in front of the farmhouse, while the other 2 positioned themselves to block the driveway, a clear indication that they weren't planning on anyone leaving unexpectedly. The men who emerged were exactly what Frank Morrison had described, well-dressed, expensive vehicles, and the kind of cold professionalism that spoke of corporate security rather than law enforcement. The man who approached them was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His smile was polished and predatory, the expression of someone who was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation disguised as politeness. "Mr. Shaw?" he said, extending a hand that Gareth pointedly ignored. "I'm Douglas Kellerman, head of security for Sterling Enterprises. We're looking for someone who might have come through your area recently, and we hoped you might be able to help us. Depends on who you're looking for and why." Gareth replied evenly. Kellerman's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "We're looking for Victoria Jade Fern. She's been missing for several days now, and her family is very concerned about her well-being. Miss Fern has been dealing with some mental health challenges since her parents' death, and she may not be thinking clearly. The lie was delivered so smoothly that someone who didn't know the truth might have believed it. But Gareth had heard Jade's story, had seen the bruises on her wrists and the terror in her eyes. and he recognized manipulation when he heard it. Haven't seen anyone matching that description, Gareth said. This is a working farm, not exactly a place where troubled city folks tend to wander. Of course, Kellerman said, still maintaining his artificial politeness. But we have reason to believe she might have sought shelter in rural areas. She was wearing a distinctive white dress when she disappeared, and she's quite beautiful, the kind of person who would stand out even in a small community. Dylan stepped slightly closer to his father, and Gareth could feel the teenager's tension. His son was smart enough to understand the subtext of this conversation, the veiled threats hidden beneath Kellerman's professional courtesy. As I said, we haven't seen anyone like that, Gareth repeated. If that's all, actually, Mr. Shaw, I'm afraid it's not. Kellerman's smile finally faded, revealing the harder man beneath. You see, we have evidence that Miss Fern was in this area as recently as yesterday. Phone pings, credit card usage, witness statements. We know she's here. Gareth felt his heart racing, but kept his expression neutral. Jade had been using cash only and had turned off her phone, but Sterling obviously had resources that went beyond normal tracking methods. Even if that were true, Gareth said carefully, I still haven't seen her. Mr. Shaw, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the situation here. Kellerman gestured toward his associates, who had spread out around the property with practiced efficiency. Miss Fern is not just a missing person. She's the heir to a substantial fortune, and there are legal questions about her mental competency that need to be resolved. By harboring her, you would be interfering with a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. The lie was sophisticated and terrifying in its implications. If Sterling had managed to get court orders based on false psychiatric evaluations, then Jade's fears about his connections in the legal system were justified. I'm not harboring anyone, Gareth said firmly, and I'd like you to leave my property. Kellerman's expression hardened completely. Mr. Shaw, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. Mr. Sterling is a very influential man with substantial resources and many friends in law enforcement and the judicial system. Interfering with his efforts to help Miss Fern could result in serious legal consequences for you and your family. The threat was unmistakable now, and Gareth felt a cold anger building in his chest. These men weren't just looking for Jade. They were prepared to destroy anyone who got in their way. Are you threatening me? Gareth asked quietly. I'm informing you of the potential consequences of making poor decisions, Kellerman replied smoothly. For instance, it would be unfortunate if there were questions raised about your suitability as a guardian for your son, or if regulatory agencies decided to take a closer look at your farming operation. These things can be very disruptive to a person's life. Dylan stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. You can't just, Dylan, Gareth said sharply, cutting his son off before he could say something that would escalate the situation further. But the damage was already done. Kellerman had seen the teenager's reaction and understood that his threats were hitting their mark. Smart boy, Kellerman said, his predatory smile returning. I'm sure he understands the importance of family staying together, staying safe. That's when the sound of another approaching vehicle cut through the tension. A battered pickup truck was coming up the driveway, and Gareth felt a surge of relief when he recognized Frank Morrison behind the wheel. The older farmer pulled up beside the SUVs and climbed out with the deliberate movements of someone who wasn't intimidated by expensive vehicles or city suits. Morning, Gareth, Frank said cheerfully, as if armed security teams were a normal part of his daily routine. Thought I'd stop by to return that socket wrench set I borrowed last week. Kellerman turned toward Frank with visible irritation. Sir, this is a private conversation. I'm going to have to ask you to. Private conversation on my neighbor's property. Frank interrupted, his tone still friendly but with an edge of steel underneath. That's interesting. You boys with the county sheriff's department? Don't recognize you from town. We're private security conducting a lawful investigation, Kellerman said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Private security, Frank repeated thoughtfully. Well, that's different. See, around here, we tend to be protective of our neighbors, especially when strangers show up asking questions and making what sound like threats. As if summoned by some rural communication network, 2 more pickup trucks appeared on the county road, slowing as they approached the driveway. Gareth recognized both vehicles, Tom Peterson from the farm to the north, and Bill Crawford, who ran the feed store in town. Word traveled fast in farming communities, and apparently, Frank had made some phone calls. Kellerman looked around at the gathering farmers with visible frustration. He was clearly prepared to intimidate a single family. But a group of armed rural property owners was a different proposition entirely. This isn't over, Mr. Shaw, Kellerman said finally. Miss Fern needs medical attention that only Mr. Sterling can provide. When she's found, and she will be found, anyone who delayed her treatment will be held responsible. If this young lady needs help, Frank said mildly, seems like the local sheriff and medical professionals would be the appropriate people to provide it. We don't much care for outsiders making threats against our neighbors. The standoff continued for another tense minute before Kellerman finally gestured to his men. They retreated to their vehicles with the controlled movements of professionals who had been outmaneuvered but weren't giving up. As the SUVs pulled away, Kellerman rolled down his window for one final threat. 24 hours, Mr. Shaw. After that, Mr. Sterling will be forced to pursue other avenues to ensure Miss Fern's safety. After the security team was gone, Frank and the other farmers lingered for a few minutes, making it clear that they were keeping an eye on the situation. When they finally left, Gareth and Dylan went inside to find Jade emerging from the basement, her face pale but determined. I heard everything, she said quietly. They're not going to stop, are they? No, Gareth admitted. And now they know we're protecting you. Which means you're both in danger because of me. Jade's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Dylan could lose his father. You could lose your farm, your home, everything you've built here. That's our choice to make, Dylan said firmly. Nobody gets to threaten my family and think we'll just back down. Jade looked between father and son, seeing the determination in both their faces, and felt something shift inside her. For months, she'd been running, hiding, trying to survive Sterling's control through avoidance and fear. But watching these good people put themselves at risk for her sake, she realized that survival wasn't enough anymore. You're right, she said, meeting Gareth's eyes. It's time to stop running. It's time to fight back. What do you have in mind? Gareth asked. Jade smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her in the barn, it wasn't a smile tinged with fear or sadness. It was the smile of someone who had finally remembered that she was stronger than her circumstances. I have an idea, but it's going to require trust in some people we've never met and taking risks that could backfire spectacularly. I'm listening, Gareth said. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but inside the farmhouse, 3 people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances began planning their counterattack against a man who thought money and power made him untouchable. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as the 3 of them gathered around the kitchen table, rain drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Jade had her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard with a confidence and purpose that Gareth hadn't seen from her before. The terrified woman he'd found in his barn was transforming before his eyes into someone else entirely, someone who understood power and how to wield it. The first thing you need to understand about Alden Sterling, Jade said, pulling up a series of documents on her screen, is that everything he does is calculated. He doesn't make impulsive decisions or take unnecessary risks. Every move is planned, documented, and executed with precision, which makes him predictable, Dylan observed, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. Exactly. But it also makes him vulnerable, because he keeps records of everything. Jade's smile was sharp with satisfaction, including things he probably shouldn't have documented. She turned the laptop around so both Gareth and Dylan could see what she'd been working on. The screen displayed a complex organizational chart showing Sterling Enterprises' corporate structure, but with annotations and connections that revealed a much darker picture than any official business filing would show. During the months I was living in his house, I had access to his home office, Jade explained. Alden is obsessive about documentation. He keeps digital records of every phone call, every meeting, every financial transaction. He thinks it protects him legally, but it also means there's a paper trail for everything he's done. Gareth studied the chart, his engineering background helping him trace the connections between shell companies, offshore accounts, and legal entities. This looks like money laundering, among other things, Jade confirmed. Alden's business practices aren't just unethical, they're criminal. Tax evasion, fraud, bribery of public officials, intimidation of witnesses. He's been operating under the assumption that his money and connections make him untouchable, so he's gotten careless about covering his tracks. Dylan pointed at a section of the chart that showed multiple connections to government contracts. Are those real companies or just fronts? Mix of both. Some are legitimate businesses that he uses to hide illegal activities. Others are completely fabricated entities that exist only on paper. Jade clicked through several folders, revealing spreadsheets full of financial data that painted a picture of systematic corruption. The problem is, all of this evidence is technically stolen. I downloaded it from his personal servers without permission, which means it might not be admissible in court. But it's still useful, Gareth said, beginning to understand where this was heading. Even if we can't use it directly, it shows us where to look for evidence that can be obtained legally. Exactly. And more importantly, it shows us who else has been victimized by Alden's schemes. Jade opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be a contact database. He's done this before, Gareth. I'm not his first victim. I'm just the one with the largest inheritance. The revelation hung in the air like a physical weight. Gareth had assumed that Sterling's targeting of Jade was opportunistic, a predator taking advantage of a grieving woman's vulnerability. But this suggested something far more systematic and disturbing. How many others? Dylan asked quietly. At least 7 that I can document, probably more. Jade's voice was steady, but Gareth could see the anger burning in her eyes. Elderly widows whose families thought they were getting married for companionship. Young women who inherited family businesses and needed guidance managing their new responsibilities. A disabled veteran whose military pension and insurance settlement made him an attractive target. What happened to them? Various things. Some had their assets gradually transferred to shell companies that Alden controls. Others were declared mentally incompetent and had guardianship transferred to him or his associates. The veteran died under suspicious circumstances after changing his will to benefit Sterling Enterprises. Gareth felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about Jade's inheritance. They were dealing with someone who had built an entire criminal enterprise around victimizing vulnerable people. We have to go to the FBI, he said. This is way beyond local law enforcement. I thought so too, Jade replied. But look at this. She pulled up another document, this one showing political donations and consulting fees paid by Sterling Enterprises. The list included names that Gareth recognized from news coverage, senators, federal judges, high-ranking FBI officials. He's bought protection at every level, Dylan said, scanning the list with growing dismay. Not everyone, Jade corrected, but enough to make it very dangerous to approach federal authorities without absolute proof and a carefully planned strategy. One phone call from the wrong person, and we'd be dealing with more than just private security teams. Gareth leaned back in his chair, trying to process the scope of what they were facing. So what's your plan? Jade closed the laptop and looked directly at him, her expression more determined than he'd ever seen it. "We're going to destroy him. The same way he's been destroying other people, systematically, methodically, and with perfect documentation." "How?" "By turning his own network against him." Jade stood up and began pacing the kitchen, her mind clearly working through complex calculations. Alden's power comes from his ability to control information and manipulate people's perceptions. But his criminal activities have created enemies, people who've been victimized, business partners who've been cheated, government officials who aren't on his payroll. She returned to the laptop and opened a new set of files. "I've been in contact with some of these people over the past few months, carefully building relationships and gathering information. There's a federal prosecutor in Chicago who's been investigating Sterling Enterprises for years, but hasn't been able to get enough evidence for indictments. There's a journalist in Milwaukee who's been documenting suspicious deaths and disappearances connected to Alden's business associates. And there are 3 of his former victims who are willing to testify if they can be guaranteed protection." Gareth was beginning to see the outline of her strategy, and it was far more sophisticated than anything he'd imagined. "You've been planning this for months, ever since I realized that running away wasn't going to be enough. Alden has too many resources, too many connections. The only way to stop him is to make it more dangerous for him to continue his criminal activities than it is for him to leave me alone. But that means," Dylan started. "It means we're going to war," Jade finished. "Not just hiding from him or defending ourselves, but actively working to destroy his criminal empire and put him in prison where he belongs." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Gareth understood that this was the moment of decision, not just whether to help Jade escape from Sterling, but whether to commit to a plan that would put all of them in serious danger while potentially saving dozens of other victims. "What would you need from us?" he asked finally. Jade's smile was grateful but also fierce. "Everything. Alden's security team knows I'm in this area, but they don't know exactly where. We have maybe 18 hours before they start conducting systematic searches of every property within a 10-mile radius. During that time, I need to contact my allies, coordinate our evidence-gathering efforts, and put the legal machinery in motion. And after that, we disappear. All of us. The federal prosecutor has access to witness protection resources, but it means leaving everything behind: your farm, Dylan's school, the life you've built here." The sacrifice she was asking them to make was enormous. Gareth looked at his son, seeing his own thoughts reflected in Dylan's face. They would be giving up 4 years of rebuilding, the farm that had been in their family for 3 generations, the community that had embraced them after Rebecca's death, but they would also be stopping a predator who had destroyed countless lives and was planning to continue doing so indefinitely. "Dad," Dylan said quietly, "what would Mom have wanted us to do?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything. Rebecca had been a nurse, someone who dedicated her life to healing and protecting vulnerable people. She would have understood the cost of what Jade was asking, but she also would have understood the cost of doing nothing. "She would have said that some things are more important than security," Gareth replied, "and that you can't build a good life on the foundation of someone else's suffering." Dylan nodded slowly. "Then we do it." Jade looked between father and son, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to. Alden will try to destroy you both. Even if we succeed in stopping him, your lives will never be the same. Our lives already changed the moment we decided to help you," Gareth said gently. "This is just the next step." For the next hour, Jade outlined her plan in detail. It was complex, risky, and required perfect timing, but it was also comprehensive in a way that suggested months of careful preparation. She had backup plans for the backup plans, contingencies for every scenario she could imagine, and resources that Sterling didn't know she possessed. The key was coordination. While Jade made contact with the federal prosecutor and the journalist, Gareth would work with Frank Morrison and the local farming community to create a network of safe houses and communication channels. Dylan would be responsible for documenting everything and maintaining secure digital backups of all evidence. The most dangerous part will be the next 24 hours, Jade explained. Once we initiate contact with federal authorities, Alden will know that his time is limited. He'll escalate his efforts to find me, and he'll start destroying evidence. We need to be ready for anything. What about Kellerman and his security team? Dylan asked. They're mercenaries, not true believers. Once it becomes clear that Alden is going down, they'll distance themselves from the situation quickly. The real danger comes from the people who are personally invested in protecting him. The politicians and officials who've taken his money. The business partners who've participated in his crimes. As if summoned by their conversation, Gareth's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed Frank Morrison's name, and when Gareth answered, his neighbor's voice was tense with urgency. Gareth, you need to know that there are more of those SUVs on the county roads. At least 6 vehicles, maybe more, and they're stopping at every farm and asking questions. Tom Peterson said they're offering money for information about strangers in the area. How much time do we have? Gareth asked. Maybe 2 hours before they work their way over to our section. But that's not the worst part. Frank's voice dropped lower. Bill Crawford was in town earlier, and he heard from the sheriff's department that there's been a federal warrant issued for the arrest of someone matching your guest's description. Psychiatric hold, dangerous to herself and others. Gareth felt his blood run cold. Sterling had escalated faster than any of them had anticipated. Frank, I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable, but I need you to trust me. For the next 10 minutes, Gareth outlined Jade's true situation and their plan to expose Sterling's criminal activities. He could hear Frank's sharp intake of breath as the scope of the situation became clear. Jesus, Gareth. You're talking about taking on someone with serious federal connections. I know. And I know it puts all of you at risk just by being associated with us. Frank was quiet for a long moment. You remember what I told you when you first moved here? About how this community takes care of its own, I remember. Well, that girl became one of ours the moment you decided to protect her. You tell me what you need, and we'll make it happen. After Gareth hung up, he found Jade and Dylan staring at him with expressions of amazement and gratitude. He's going to help, Dylan said. It wasn't a question. They all are, Gareth confirmed. But that means we're not just risking our own lives anymore. We're asking an entire community to stand up against federal corruption and organized crime. Jade stood up slowly, her hands steady for the first time since he'd found her in the barn. Then we better make sure we win. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but inside the farmhouse, 3 people who had found courage in each other began implementing a plan that would either save dozens of innocent lives or destroy everything. They held dear. For Jade Fern, it was the moment she stopped being a victim and became a force for justice. For Gareth and Dylan Shaw, it was the moment they discovered that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight. The transformation of Oakwood County into a sophisticated intelligence operation happened with the quiet efficiency that only rural communities could manage. Within 2 hours of Frank Morrison's phone call, a network of farmers, shop owners, and longtime residents had mobilized into something that would have impressed military strategists. Jade sat in Frank's kitchen, her laptop connected to a secure satellite internet connection that Bill Crawford had installed for his feed store's inventory system. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was coordinating a federal investigation from a farmhouse kitchen while surrounded by men in work boots and flannel shirts who understood corruption and power better than most politicians. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chun is standing by, Jade reported, looking up from her screen. She's been building a case against Sterling for 3 years, but she's needed someone with inside access to his operations. She's flying in from Chicago tonight with a full investigative team. Frank Morrison sat across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better decades. What does she need from us? Time mostly, and documentation. Jade pulled up a secure messaging app that looked nothing like the consumer versions most people used. We need to keep Sterling's security teams busy for the next 12 hours, while Chun's people get search warrants for his properties and financial records. Once they start serving warrants, his lawyers will begin destroying evidence immediately. And how exactly do we keep professional security teams busy? Asked Tom Peterson, who had driven over from his neighboring farm with news that Sterling's SUVs were systematically working their way through the county. Jade's smile was sharp with satisfaction. By giving them exactly what they're looking for, and making sure it's completely useless to them. The plan she outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Over the next several hours, farmers throughout the county would report sightings of a woman matching Jade's description. Each report would be carefully timed and geographically distributed to keep Sterling's search teams moving constantly without ever getting close to their actual location. Meanwhile, the real Jade would be coordinating with federal authorities. From the one place Sterling would never think to look, the heart of the rural community that had already demonstrated its willingness to protect her. My nephew Danny works for the county dispatch, offered Mary Crawford, Bill's wife, who had arrived with a thermos of coffee and a notebook full of phone numbers. He can make sure that any official requests for information about our activities get lost in bureaucratic delays. And my daughter Jessica teaches at the high school, added Frank. She's got contacts at the county clerk's office, the sheriff's department, and the state police. Nothing official, but enough to know when certain types of paperwork are being filed. Jade stared at the assembled group, a dozen farmers and small business owners, who were casually discussing obstruction of a federal investigation, as if they were planning a church potluck. The contrast with Sterling's world of bought politicians and intimidated officials couldn't have been more stark. You understand what you're risking? She asked quietly. If this goes wrong, all of you could face federal charges for interfering with a law enforcement operation. Frank's response was immediate and certain. Young lady, this community has been dealing with powerful people who think they can push us around since before you were born. We know how to protect our own. The first test of their improvised network came sooner than expected. Dylan, who had been monitoring police scanners from the Morrisons' spare bedroom, called down that multiple vehicles were approaching from the south. 6 SUVs moving in formation, he reported. They're stopping at the Henderson place now. Frank picked up an old CB radio and keyed the microphone. Breaker 19, this is Overwatch. We've got company approaching Sector 7. All units. Be advised, the response was immediate. Voices crackled across the airwaves as farmers throughout the county began reporting the movement of Sterling's search teams. More importantly, they began implementing the diversion plan that Jade had outlined. Tom Peterson to Overwatch, came the first report. I've got visual on a woman matching the description walking along Highway 78, about 2 miles east of the grain elevator. Dark hair, appears to be disoriented. The woman Tom had spotted was actually his own daughter Sarah, home from college for the weekend and perfectly willing to play her part in the deception. She would lead Sterling's security team on a 20-minute chase through back roads, before disappearing into the woods behind properties owned by sympathetic neighbors. Similar. Our EPORTS began coming in from across the county. Each sighting was carefully coordinated to seem credible while leading the search teams away from Frank Morrison's farm. The beauty of the plan was that Sterling's people couldn't ignore any of the reports. They had to investigate each one, which meant they were constantly racing from one false lead to another. Meanwhile, Jade was deep in encrypted communication with people whose existence Sterling had never suspected. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chun was coordinating with FBI financial crimes units in 3 states. Journalist Michael Torres was working with editors at major newspapers to prepare exposes that would destroy Sterling's reputation, even if the criminal charges failed. And most importantly, 3 of Sterling's previous victims were being moved to secure locations where they could provide testimony without fear of retaliation. The key is timing, Jade explained to the assembled group as reports continued to come in from around the county. Chun's team needs to serve search warrants on Sterling's primary residence, his corporate offices, and at least 6 shell company locations simultaneously. If he gets word that one location has been compromised, he'll immediately begin destroying evidence at the others. What about his private security? Dillon asked, returning from his monitoring post with updated information. Kellerman's teams are getting frustrated with all the false sightings. They're starting to question some of the reports more aggressively. That's actually good news, Jade replied. The more aggressive they become with local residents, the more attention they'll attract from legitimate law enforcement. Chun has already alerted the state police and FBI field offices that there are armed private security teams operating in the area without proper authorization. The breakthrough came at sunset when Mary Crawford's nephew called with information. That changed everything. Danny says there's been some interesting activity on the federal law enforcement networks, Mary reported after hanging up her phone. Multiple agencies requesting search warrants for properties associated with Sterling Enterprises. And there's been a federal judge in Chicago who's been working late, reviewing what Danny describes as a very thick stack of warrant applications. Jade's laptop chimed with an encrypted message that made her sit up straighter. Chun's got her. Warrants, all of them. Federal judges in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan have signed off on simultaneous searches of Sterling's properties. When? Frank asked. 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Coordinated raids on 12 locations with federal agents, state police, and local law enforcement participating. Jade's voice was tight with nervous excitement. By this time tomorrow, either Alden Sterling will be in federal custody or we'll all be fugitives. The room fell silent as the weight of what they were attempting settled over everyone. They weren't just helping someone escape from an abusive situation. They were taking down a criminal enterprise that had federal protection and millions of dollars in resources. There's something else, Jade said quietly. Chun wants me to be present during the raid on Sterling's primary residence. Not just as a witness, but as someone who can identify specific pieces of evidence and guide investigators to the most important materials. That's incredibly dangerous, Gareth said immediately. Sterling's house will be the most heavily defended location. It's also the location where the most critical evidence is stored, Jade replied. Chun's people are good, but they don't know Sterling's security systems, his hidden safes, or the locations where he keeps his most incriminating documents. Without my help, they might miss evidence that could make the difference between conviction and acquittal. Dillon spoke up from across the room. Then we go with you. Absolutely not, Jade said firmly. You've already done more than enough. You've given me the chance to fight back, and you've helped coordinate this operation. But tomorrow morning, you need to be as far away from Sterling's property as possible. That's not how this family works, Gareth said quietly. We don't abandon people when things get dangerous. We see it through to the end. The argument that followed revealed the depth of the bonds that had formed between the 3 of them over the past week. Jade was desperate to protect the people who had saved her, while Gareth and Dillon were equally determined not to let her face the final confrontation alone. It was Frank Morrison who proposed the compromise that satisfied everyone. What if Jade goes with the federal agents, but she's got backup nearby that Sterling doesn't know about? What kind of backup? Jade asked. Frank's smile was grim with satisfaction. The kind that understands rural geography better than any city security team. and the kind that has every legal right to be hunting on properties adjacent to Sterling's estate. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. During hunting season, which had just begun, farmers and rural residents routinely moved through wooded areas surrounding large estates. Frank's network could position armed hunters throughout the forest surrounding Sterling's property, ostensibly tracking deer, but actually providing overwatch for the federal raid. If things go wrong, Frank explained, you'll have 20 experienced hunters with high-powered rifles providing cover. Sterling's security team might be professionals, but they're not used to operating in terrain where the locals have home field advantage. Jade looked around the room at the faces of people who had transformed from strangers into allies in less than a week. Mary Crawford was coordinating communication networks with the efficiency of a military commander. Tom Peterson was studying topographical maps and identifying the best positions for their Overwatch teams. Bill Crawford was checking weather reports and planning for contingencies. These weren't trained operatives or federal agents. They were farmers and shop owners and retirees who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. "Why?" Jade asked finally. "Why are all of you willing to risk everything for someone you barely know?" Frank Morrison set down his coffee mug and looked directly at her. "Because this isn't really about you, though we've come to care about you personally. This is about the kind of world we want to live in. I don't understand. Sterling represents everything that's wrong with the way power works in this country," Frank continued. "The idea that money can buy you protection from consequences, that corruption is acceptable as long as it's sophisticated enough, that ordinary people don't matter as long as you can intimidate them into silence." Tom Peterson nodded in agreement. "We've watched our communities get destroyed by people who think rural folks are too unsophisticated to fight back against corporate predators. Sterling's just the latest example, but he's not going to be the last unless someone makes an example of him." "Plus," Mary Crawford added with a slight smile, "it's been a long time since anything this interesting happened in Oakwood County. Most of us have been bored out of our minds since our kids grew up and moved away." The laughter that followed was nervous but genuine, a release of tension that reminded everyone that they were still human beings caught up in extraordinary circumstances. As the evening wore on, the improvised operations center in Frank Morrison's kitchen continued to coordinate activities across the county. Sterling's security teams were systematically being led on wild goose chases, while federal investigators prepared for the largest coordinated raid in the region's history. At midnight, Jade received a final encrypted message from Prosecutor Chun. "All teams in position. Warrants executed at 0600 hours. Are you ready?" Jade looked around the room at the people who had become her family, her allies, and her salvation. Gareth sat next to Dylan, both of them checking equipment and reviewing maps with the focused intensity of people preparing for battle. Frank Morrison was coordinating final positions for his hunter network, his voice calm and confident on the CB radio. For the first time in months, Jade Fern felt like herself again. Not the terrified victim hiding in a barn, not the helpless heiress being manipulated by a predator, but the daughter of innovative business owners who had built something meaningful through determination and intelligence. "Yes," she typed back to Chun, "we're ready." Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but this time they felt like an omen of justice rather than danger. In less than 6 hours, one way or another, Alden Sterling's reign of terror would be over. Dawn broke gray and cold over Oakwood County, but for the first time in months, Jade Fern felt the sunrise bring hope instead of dread. She sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked federal vehicle, watching FBI agent Sarah Chun review final operational details on a tablet while their convoy wound through the early morning mist toward Alden Sterling's estate. "Remember," Chun said, without looking up from her screen, "your job is to identify and locate evidence, not to confront Sterling directly. My agents will handle all interactions with him and his security team." Jade nodded, though her attention was focused on the radio. Chatter coming through Chen's earpiece. Simultaneous raids were beginning across 3 states, with federal agents serving search warrants on 12 different properties associated with Sterling Enterprises. The coordination was flawless, a testament to the months of preparation that Chun's team had put into building their case. Overwatch 1 to Federal Command, crackled a familiar voice through the radio. Frank Morrison, positioned in the woods surrounding Sterling's property with his improvised hunter network, was providing real-time intelligence about the estate's security measures. "We have visual on 6 armed personnel around the main residence," Frank reported. 3 vehicles parked in defensive positions, but no indication they're aware of the approaching federal units. Chun keyed her microphone. "Copy that, Overwatch 1. Maintain observation and report any changes." The irony wasn't lost on Jade that Frank Morrison, a farmer whose formal education had ended with high school, was providing tactical support for one of the largest federal investigations in the region's history. But then, nothing about the past week had followed conventional patterns. Sterling's estate appeared through the trees, like something from a different world. The massive stone mansion sat on manicured grounds that probably cost more to maintain than most families earned in a year. Security cameras tracked their approach, and Jade could see armed guards taking defensive positions as the federal convoy became visible. "All units, this is command," Chun spoke into her radio. "Execute, execute, execute." What happened next was a masterclass in law enforcement coordination. Federal agents emerged from vehicles positioned at every access point to the property, their movements synchronized with military precision. State police units blocked all roads leading to the estate, while FBI financial crime specialists prepared to serve warrants on the corporate offices in downtown Milwaukee. Jade watched through the vehicle's bulletproof windows as Alden Sterling emerged from his mansion, flanked by 2 attorneys and wearing the expression of a man who had just realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Even from a distance, she could see the moment when Sterling spotted her in the federal vehicle. His face transformed from confident indignation to something approaching genuine fear as he understood that his primary victim had not only escaped his control, but had become the architect of his downfall. "Jade Fern," Chun said quietly. "Meet the man who's going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison." The next 6 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of justice. With Jade's guidance, federal agents located hidden safes containing incriminating documents, discovered sophisticated surveillance equipment that Sterling had used to monitor his victims, and uncovered financial records that revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. The most damning evidence was found in Sterling's private office, a locked filing cabinet containing detailed profiles of his victims, including psychological evaluations designed to identify their vulnerabilities and strategic plans for gaining control of their assets. Jade's file was among them, marked with handwritten notes that described her as isolated, grief-stricken, perfect target for extended manipulation. "This is enough to put him away for multiple lifetimes," Chun told Jade, as FBI agents photographed and cataloged hundreds of pieces of evidence. Money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and about a dozen other federal crimes. The psychological manipulation you experienced was just the tip of the iceberg. By noon, Alden Sterling was in federal custody, along with 6 associates, and 3 government officials who had accepted bribes to protect his operations. Douglas Kellerman and his security team had surrendered without resistance once it became clear that their employer could no longer pay their fees or protect them from prosecution. The news coverage that followed was unprecedented for rural Wisconsin. Journalist Michael Torres, working with evidence provided by federal prosecutors, published a series of articles that exposed the full scope of Sterling's criminal network and the vulnerability of inheritance laws to systematic abuse. The story went national within hours, triggering congressional hearings and leading to new federal legislation designed to protect grieving families from predatory schemes. But for Jade, Gareth, and Dylan, the most important moment came when Agent Chun finally told them they were safe. Sterling's in federal custody, his assets are frozen, and his network is completely dismantled, Chun reported as they gathered in Frank Morrison's kitchen that evening. You won't need witness protection, and you can resume your normal lives. Normal lives. As Jade looked around the kitchen where she'd planned Sterling's downfall just 24 hours earlier, she realized that none of them would ever be the same people they had been before this week began. 6 months later, the sign at the edge of town now read, Oakwood County, Home of Heroes, though most residents were too modest to acknowledge the fame that had come to their small agricultural community. Tour buses occasionally arrived, filled with visitors who wanted to see where ordinary citizens had taken down a criminal empire. But life had largely returned to its familiar rhythms. Jade stood in the doorway of what had once been Frank Morrison's spare bedroom, now transformed into the regional headquarters for the Sterling Victim Advocacy Center. The non-profit organization she'd founded with part of her recovered inheritance served families throughout the Midwest who were dealing with predatory financial schemes, providing legal assistance, counseling services, and safe houses for people fleeing abusive relationships. The Henderson family called, reported Jessica Morrison, Frank's daughter, who had left her teaching job to become the center's full-time coordinator. They're ready to file charges against the investment firm that was pressuring their grandmother to sign over her property. Jade nodded, making notes on a case file that would have seemed impossibly complex to her 6 months ago. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, but it gave her a sense of purpose that she'd never experienced during her privileged youth. Every family they helped, every predator they exposed, felt like another small victory against the forces that had once nearly destroyed her own life. Through the window, she could see across the fields to where Gareth was working on his combine harvester. The machine ran perfectly now, thanks to upgrades and repairs funded by a grant from the Victim Advocacy Center. More importantly, the Shaw farm had become a symbol in the agricultural community, proof that small operations could thrive when supported by cooperative networks and community investment. Dylan appeared in the doorway. Home from his first semester at the University of Wisconsin, where he was studying agricultural law with a focus on protecting family farms from corporate exploitation. At 18, he carried himself with a confidence and purpose that made Jade proud every time she saw him. Dad says dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, he reported. And Frank's bringing over the preliminary plans for the community center expansion. The community center had been another unexpected outcome of their battle with Sterling. Federal seizure of his assets had generated millions of dollars in restitution for his victims, and much of that money had been invested in rural development projects throughout Oakwood County. New businesses were opening, young families were moving to the area, and the agricultural economy was thriving in ways that hadn't been seen for decades. "How is your constitutional law class?" Jade asked as they walked toward the main house. "Fascinating," Dylan replied with the enthusiasm that had become his trademark. "We're studying cases where communities organized to resist federal overreach, and Professor Martinez used our situation as an example of effective grassroots advocacy." Jade smiled at the pride in his voice. Dylan had become something of a celebrity on campus, not just for his role in bringing down Sterling, but for his articulate presentations about rural communities and social justice. He'd been invited to speak at conferences across the Midwest, sharing insights about how traditional farming values could address modern problems. The kitchen of the Shaw farmhouse had evolved into something like a command center for regional activism. The dinner table was covered with legal documents, grant applications, and correspondence from families seeking help. But it was also still fundamentally a family kitchen, filled with the sounds and smells of home-cooked meals and comfortable conversation. Gareth looked up from the stove as they entered. his face brightening with the easy happiness that had become his default expression over the past months. The transformation in him was perhaps the most remarkable of all, from a man carrying the weight of loss and responsibility, alone, to someone who had found joy in building something larger than himself. "Perfect timing," he said, gesturing toward the dishes he was preparing. "I was just thinking about how different this kitchen feels compared to 6 months ago." "Different how?" Jade asked, though she knew the answer. "Fuller," Gareth replied simply. "Not just because there are more people, but because it feels like a place where things happen instead of a place where we just existed." Frank Morrison arrived as they were setting the table, carrying architectural plans and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had discovered that retirement was much more interesting when it involved revolutionary social change. "County commissioners approved the expansion," he announced without preamble. "Construction starts in the spring, and we'll have space for legal clinics, financial counseling, and temporary housing for families in crisis." The plans he spread across the table showed a modern facility that would serve as a model for rural advocacy centers throughout the region. But more than that, it represented a commitment by the community to never again allow predators like Sterling to operate without opposition. "There's something else," Frank added, his tone becoming more serious. "I got a call from the governor's office today. They want to nominate Jade for the state's humanitarian award." Jade felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Frank, that's not necessary." "Yes, it is," Dylan interrupted firmly. "What you did wasn't just about stopping Sterling. You showed people that victims don't have to stay victims, that intelligence and courage can overcome almost any kind of power." "What we did," Jade corrected. "None of this would have been possible without all of you." As they gathered around the dinner table, Jade found herself thinking about the woman who had hidden in Gareth's barn 6 months earlier. That person felt like a stranger now, someone defined by fear and helplessness rather than purpose and strength. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. "You know what I realized today?" Gareth said as they began eating. "Rebecca would have loved all of this. Not the danger or the stress, but the sense that we were part of something important, something that made a difference." Dylan nodded slowly. "She always said that the best way to honor people we've lost is to live in a way that would make them proud." "I think she would be proud," Jade said quietly, "of both of you and of what this community has become." The conversation that followed covered plans for the advocacy center, updates on other families they were helping, and news from Dylan's studies. But underlying it all was a sense of contentment that came from understanding that their choices had created something beautiful and lasting. As the evening wound down, Jade stepped onto the front porch and looked out across the fields that had become her home. In the distance, she could see lights in the windows of neighboring farms, each representing families who had been touched by their battle against Sterling and who were now part of a stronger, more connected community. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chun. "Sterling sentenced to 47 years in federal prison. 3 of his associates got 15 to 20 years each. The judge said it was one of the most comprehensive financial fraud cases she'd ever seen. You should be proud." Proud. Jade smiled and deleted the message without responding. Sterling's fate wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was the family she'd found, the work she was doing, and the knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. When they chose courage over comfort, behind her, she could hear Gareth and Dylan cleaning up the kitchen while Frank reviewed plans for their next project, a scholarship fund for students from low-income, rural families who wanted to study law or social work. Their voices were animated with excitement about the possibilities ahead, and Jade felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a victim hiding in a barn. Tonight, she was home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,